Hey everybody, Magdalena here. Today is gonna be one of those really, really important calls where a lot of the stuff that may be happening with your health has been going on for a very long time, including, for example, you eating really healthy foods such as, people tell you, "Oh, have apple cider vinegar before starting the day, or have a shot of lemon juice, and have some kombucha because it's supposed to be really great for you, right? All these probiotics and all that. And instead of feeling amazing, you start getting itchy all over. You're getting flushed. You start getting red chest and red forearms, and then develop a headache, or you have a glass of wine. Everybody else is feeling fine, and you seem to be feeling like you've got a truck hit you, and and then you've got these ongoing GI issues and anxiety just coming out of nowhere, um, and you eating really healthy, or maybe it's you when you have had 20 different diagnoses from different doctors, and they kind of don't make sense. I mean, they're just trying to fit it into to make it work, but that it's just not working. And so anyway, I think that this call is really dedicated to those of you who just can't figure out what the heck is going on. And so it could be that histamine is the issue. I've had my one of my closest friends, Yasmina Yakelstam, the founder of Healing Histamine, was the one who really got me to appreciate histamine and how to deal with it, and how to, as you know, some of you may know, she pretty much addressed her health issues. Once she discovered that was life changing for her, and she had over, I think, 40 different diagnoses. She was put on so many different medications, and nobody really knew what was going on. And so, unfortunately, September this year is going to be the second year anniversary of her death, not from histamine, but from an unrelated case. But the wonderful thing about that happened is through Yasmina, I have met Dr. Beth O'Hara, who's here on the call with me. And Beth is continuing to do this work. In fact, I would love for you to talk about it, Beth, like how it has changed your own life too. But really, we want to dedicate this call for all of you guys who are just really suffering in silence. And, who knows? I mean, maybe it's not histamine, maybe it's not a muscle activation, but maybe, who knows? Maybe it is. And it's going to be like, is that pivotal moment that might change your life forever. So we're going to be talking a little bit about histamine and hormones as well, but I really want to spend more time on just like uncovering, just starting off from the top. Beth, why don't we talk about that? Someone who is like, what do you typically see when you meet, like, you're sitting in a restaurant, you're having dinner, and you're having this couple having a conversation, right? And this woman is telling a guy, like, I'm having this, I'm having that. And you're thinking like, oh my God, you've got histamine issues going on. So what typically would that be that we should be really looking out for? We'll be like, maybe it's histamine.
Well, I think part of it is that these symptoms can be so confusing because histamine acts in most of the systems in the body. And you can get these constellation of symptoms that are histamine or mast cell issues for one person. They're totally different for another. So some examples might be the really classic, and what most practitioners know about is itching, flushing, rashes, hives, typical allergy symptoms, trouble with postnasal drip, sneezing, coughing, those kinds of things. But then if we start looking at different types of presentations, it can also be things like you get acid reflux and diarrhea, or you have sleep issues and mood issues. So we're really looking for when there are symptoms in 2 or more systems. And I can share just a little piece of my own story because I was such a great classic example.
Great, yes.
From an early age, I had really terrible allergies. I mean, the kind where, like, if I petted a cat and touched my face, I would be clawing at my eyes for hours. And if I grew up in the country, so when you live in the country, you usually grow a lot of vegetables, especially green beans, and you pick and snap and can green beans all summer long. And every time I would have to do that, that was my chore. I would just totally break out in hives, head to toe, and just itching nonstop. The only thing that could calm it down was Benadryl. But I also started having dark depression, even at a young age, and anxiety. So there were the mood symptoms, lots of digestive symptoms, the acid reflux, the diarrhea. So by the time I was 12, I was on about 5 different medications, which is a lot for a kid to be on. And those medications calmed the symptoms down. But the problem is it also calmed down, or it knocked out my mast cells, which are these immune cells that help protect us from pathogens and things like viruses and bacteria and mold. And so when I took those medications, it dampened that immune response down, and my body couldn't fight those things off very well anymore. So over several years, it got much worse to where eventually I was bedridden and I had such severe fatigue, I could hardly function. So I had an entire year I spent in bed because I was so sick, I couldn't work. And I went doctor to doctor to doctor, no one could figure me out. And at one point I counted up, I had seen over 50 different practitioners. No one knew what to do with me. And most of the time they would give me some kind of diagnosis that didn't exactly fit. I had a lot of joint pain, so I was given rheumatoid arthritis, even though I didn't have the blood markers for it. I was told I had all kinds of different immune conditions. And then I was told that by many, many people that I was making it up, that I was attached to being sick because my blood work looked perfect. And that was the hardest thing to be told because I was working so hard on my health. I was eating healthy, I'd gone gluten-free, I was dairy-free, I was taking supplements, I was doing everything I could, and I desperately wanted to be better. And finally, it was actually Yasmina is how I learned about histamine intolerance and mast cell activation, and I have both. And that was the turning point for me. And so to be able to go from being bedridden, and she really helped me a lot as I was learning about that and helped just so many people. So I have a huge amount of gratitude for her and what she brought forward. And this, so we've got these two different pieces that we're talking about. Histamine intolerance is where we just have an issue with histamine. And that's usually not as significant as mast cell activation, which is the immune issue where these immune cells are dysregulated and they're putting out not just histamine, but over 1,000 different inflammatory mediators that can affect the body. So you can see why this is so difficult to pin down, but it's incredibly common. So the estimates are that mast cell activation is affecting between 9 and 17% of the general population. And in the people that have chronic health issues, my best estimate is it's a minimum of 50%, if not more. So whenever there's inflammatory issues, there's mast cell activation.
So, I didn't mention in the beginning because I wanted to do introductions more that really focus on the problem than the speaker itself. But I do want to share that you are a naturopathic doctor today. And I'm imagining that a lot of it is because of your own personal experience that led you to be doing this work.
Well, initially I actually decided at 6 years old, I was going to go to medical school.
Okay.
And I was so single focused on that. But by the time I got to college, I was really sick. And I had a full scholarship to medical school, which is rare. It's hard to get those. And I had to call the scholarship committee and tell them I wasn't going to make it because I was struggling. I just barely finished my bachelor's. I was so sick. They weren't happy with me. But I went on this whole other route. And I would have been I wanted to be a neurologist. But when traditional medicine failed me, it took me down this whole other road of studying all kinds of different modalities. And that's how I ended up circling back around from a different place and eventually got my health back.
So that's going to be one of my questions, because one of the things that before Yasmina and I became really good friends, one of the things that really attracted me to her work was her approach of, saying, just removing all the high histamine foods out of your diet, right, is not going to heal you. And right. And she did that, and she actually got so malnourished that she was weaker than ever. And she was always talking about lowering down the inflammation in the body, and turning. And I know she turned around her health that way, at least from a histamine perspective. Can you talk a little bit about like the journey, like your journey, and maybe the journey of some of the people you work with? Like, how do we just, first of all, like, do we print out a whole list of high histamine foods and then avoid them like like a plague? Or what do you do when you discover you might be having a histamine issue or mast cell activation issue?
Well, the first thing that I do with people is what I call root cause analysis. So I look at what is triggering this, what's driving it from underneath. And this is really critical because if we just go address symptoms, both histamine intolerance and mast cell activation tend to get worse over time, especially if we're only addressing it with medications. But if we go address the root pieces, and part of what is challenging about this and why you need to work with a practitioner if you have these issues is that discovering the root problems are different. Those root problems are different for each person. And so they could be things like chronic infections, particularly mold toxicity, I see a lot. They could be gut infections like SIBO. It can be things like stress is a huge trigger for both histamine intolerance and mast cell activation. We don't talk about it enough, but that imbalance with the parasympathetic nervous system. And I don't know hardly anybody that lives in a Western country that is not highly stressed, because that's just part of our culture. But there are many of these different ones, and I've consolidated these into the most common ones. But that's the first thing, is to identify those. And then it helps initially to start to reduce histamine foods just to get the levels down some. And then, but we don't want to stay there. So we want to just kind of bring it down. And then when the symptoms are getting more controlled, the root causes are getting addressed, then we want to slowly start to add more of those foods back in because they're very nutrient dense and we need those nutrients.
Yeah. Yeah. And it's interesting because somebody is asking here, is whether stress at a young age, do you think chronic stress at a young age, teen years, or stress at school is that kind of trigger for these issues too, right? So I think you've answered that. And I know, I'm just when I mentioned one of the big protocols that Yasmina was doing was that, I mean, that's why she became a meditation teacher. She's like, if I learn meditation, I need to become a teacher in order to really practice that. And that was a big part of her protocol, even though she was not the most patient, quiet person, you know, she was just always so full of life. And it's like, let's go. Like, even when she was going through her cancer, her breast cancer treatments, you know, I would like visit her in LA and she's like, yeah, we got this dinner and that place. And I'm like, are you for real? Like, I am tired. Like, you stay put at home here. So she was not a meditation person, but she realized that the power of it, how much it was helping her bring the inflammation down in her body. It was so powerful.
It's huge. And she was a good meditation teacher. I took her first class, her very first prototype class. And in my practice, well over 50% of my clients have had some kind of early childhood major stressor. They lost somebody significant, they had a major illness, there was some kind of abuse or bullying or something. And when we have these types of stressors, maybe you just think about what high school is like for people, or, you know, middle school and the social stresses. That's a lot of stress. And that kind of stress affects the immune system and the nervous system as it's developing.
Yeah.
So I tell people that in healing from these things, about 25% of work is addressing the right supplements, getting the right foods for your body. About 25% is making sure your environment is clean of mold, EMFs, you've got good air quality, good water. But 50% is addressing the nervous system balance. And that's huge.
Yeah. So let's talk a little bit about testing. Like, you know, we were talking about a lot of the symptoms, right? But you might also argue that some of these symptoms are due to food intolerances, or, you know, or like I'm triggered by specifically this allergen, so that's why I'm having an allergic reaction. What testing is available right now that's reliable or not reliable for establishing, if you have two questions, one is histamine intolerance, and has it all gone all the way to mast cell activation syndrome?
The testing is really problematic right now because, again, if we remember that, if we're talking about mast cell activation, we have over 1,000 mast cell mediators. There's no way to test somebody for all of those. We don't even have tests for all of them. But the tests that are run, the tests are required for the diagnostic criteria. The problem is that those mediators are up and down in the blood in 15 minutes. They're elevated and down. So people are often told to provoke a flare before testing to hopefully get something hopefully get a positive result, just so they can get diagnosis for insurance purposes. But that testing is missing about 90% of people with mast cell activation. With histamine intolerance, the testing would be running a methylation profile, testing DAO levels, and testing histamine levels. And that's somewhat more reliable. Histamine levels in the blood can be up and down again, but when it's really elevated, you can catch it. I don't actually push people to get the mast cell tests other than to rule out a really rare disorder called mastocytosis, and that's a really serious genetic mast cell disorder. But the other tests, if people need it for insurance purposes, and I don't work with insurance, that's why I don't worry about it. But if they're seeing somebody under insurance, then they'll probably have to run that. And some practitioners have their patients come and sit in their office for 8 hours and test them every hour, just try to get something positive. So you can see how problematic it is.
You have a free report that you want to offer our audience, our community, and so it's and I'm gonna post the link right now, you guys. Look for it as the mastcell360.com/free report. Does testing get covered in that? What's in that? Tell us more about what's that in that free report.
Free report goes through the most common root causes of mast cell activation. So things like chronic illness, chemical toxicity, heavy metals, hormone imbalances, nutrient deficiencies, stress, and so on, low oxygen. And it helps people look through them and start to identify for themselves what are their own root causes and what do they need to go address and work on.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Okay, so I just posted the report, you guys, so you can get it from there. We have a whole bunch of questions coming in, but before I dive into the questions, can we talk a little bit about, so you're suggesting basically that if somebody, so since testing is so difficult, like how do you know if I'm having histamine issues, and is that the path that I should be pursuing?
Yeah, it's a great question. So one, look at the symptoms that are associated. And then if you start to decrease high histamine foods, and if part of the diagnostic criteria actually for mast cell activation is does an antihistamine or mast cell supporting medication reduce the symptoms? And so that's one of the things you're looking for. Now that's also a little tricky because some of those medications also have mast cell triggers in them. So they have dyes, they have colors, they have titanium dioxide. So it's not foolproof. But I do have a symptom survey for mast cell activation on the website, and it's in the blog section. People can see the link there. If you want to post it, I can drop it in for you too. But
yeah, drop it into a chat so that I can post it on Facebook if you could.
Yeah, I'll grab it for you here. But what we're looking for, again, symptoms in 2 or more systems that aren't explained by something else.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And by supporting the mast cells or supporting lowering histamine, we get a reduction in symptoms. And again, if there's chronic inflammation, there's so much overlap with mast cell activation and all kinds of autoimmunity, hormone issues, cardiovascular issues, sleep issues, and so on.
Yeah.
It's just fairly common.
So we have a lot of questions coming in. Hey, you guys, I don't know whether we'll be able to, first of all, when we're doing Facebook Live, the questions that I see are 5 at a time, or we already have over close to 30. So and they just vanish. I can't see them. But Beth, would you be able to later go over the weekend and just maybe pop your head over there and see whether you can answer some of them? Or point people to
Absolutely. I'd be happy to. Yeah.
Okay. So let me just see those ones that we can answer. Some of them are just comments. I'm just going to read them out. Like Samantha Olson is saying, I break out in an itch, not puffy rash on my abdomen and back. That's pretty classical, right? Potentially.
That's pretty classical. There are a few other things that can contribute to that. But if there are other symptoms that match as well, I'd be looking into histamine and mast cell activation.
Yeah. There's quite a lot of questions about the connection between, why don't we talk about this next? Connection between histamine and estrogen.
Yes.
And hormones in general. So just, estrogen, but also other hormones.
Yeah, so there's a huge link because think about these mast cells also have thousands of receptors on the outside. And so all kinds of things. They're the main like sensing cells. There's some other sensing cells, but they're major sensing cells, and they're out there in the body looking for what could be a danger. They're also responding to how different levels change in the body, such as hormone levels. So if we start with estrogen, estrogen increases histamine levels and it triggers mast cell activation. And this is why we don't want to be estrogen dominant. If you think about a lot of symptoms of estrogen dominant, they are some mast cell symptoms. So people get excess inflammation, they start having trouble sleeping, they can get swelling, a number of things like that. Now, progesterone, though, is mast cell stabilizing. It decreases mast cell activation. And this is why even when women are in menopause or other things that are going on where they may not be producing a lot of hormones, we still want to have more progesterone than estrogen. And it's this mast cell piece underneath is part of the reason why. And then when we look at some of the other hormones, like cortisol is mast cell stabilizing when it's in a normal level. Mm-hmm. But when it drops too low, we don't have enough to stabilize the mast cells. But if it shoots too high, we're going to get more stress chemicals that trigger the mast cells. So that's why we've got to be in that sweet spot for the cortisol. And then when testosterone's too high, that will trigger mast cell activation. Of course, we don't want it too low either. Mm-hmm. And DHEA helps reduce mast cell inflammation. And so we want to have those healthy DHEA levels as well. So we don't want to completely shut those mast cells down because they're also protecting us from toxins and pathogens. But we don't want them, it's almost like they're hypervigilant.
Right.
And that happens when there's this onslaught of things hitting us.
So it sounds like you really don't want to have too much or too little of anything because, like you said, you need DHEA. I mean, if you have too much of DHEA too, then you're overproducing testosterone because testosterone is produced from DHEA, right?
Right.
And again, like you said, high testosterone can be contributing towards mast cells. The other thing is with high testosterone, you guys, is that a lot of times people, like women who have PCOS, for example, tend to have high testosterone levels. Not always, but it happens a lot of the time. And that's a lot of time related to your sugar intake and your blood sugar balance, because that affects something called the hormone, the sex hormone binding globulin, which then is suppressed when you have too much sugar, and that creates high testosterone. So it really is just a long way of saying getting blood sugar balance under control is one of the real key things, not just for hormones, but also for histamine.
And actually, that's a great point, because having elevated blood sugar and too much insulin also increases histamine and mast cell activation. So these things are also woven together.
So connected, right? Yeah, that's incredible. Maria is saying, could mold in the office building and other chemicals cause hives?
Mold is one of the biggest mast cell triggers that I see. So 80% of people in my practice have mold toxicity. And it's a real problem today because of how buildings are built now, how houses are built. EMFs increase mold growth. And so we've got a massive mold problem across North America and in many other countries.
So always test your house before buying or moving, that's for sure. And if you're suspecting, then test your current house. There's some really good testing solutions out there today, contractors who can do that. Andrea is saying, have you ever seen low estrogen as an adaptive measure by body to high histamine levels? She's seeing low estrogen on Dutch.
Yeah, that's a great question, an interesting way to look at it. I don't know of any mechanism that would specifically lower estrogen when normally we get into this downward spiral with estrogen triggering histamine, histamine triggering more estrogen, and it just keeps going. Mm-hmm. But what I do see a lot with low estrogen, and you tell me, Magdalena, because this is more your area, but I often see when people have had long-term stress, whether physical, emotional, that cortisol went high and then it dropped too low, and because a lot of our hormones are made from cortisol. I'm wondering if her cortisol is also low and there's just not enough coming down from pregnenolone.
Yeah, it kind of depends on the age, right? Because if the person is stressed out for a long time and the adrenals are not producing estrogen, then that happens with perimenopausal, menopausal women, because that's when your ovaries are beginning to shut down and the adrenals and the fat cells take over in producing estrogen. But if you're a fully menstruating woman, right, then typically low estrogen levels will be more to do with, looking at really at the ovaries and seeing what's going on there. How did it impact them? Like including, there's so many questions that come up, like, was this person on birth control pills, right? And your own native production mechanism has just gotten shut down. It just needs time. So it's a very multifactorial, I think, question. Let's see. Let me go over to the other questions. And while I'm looking for, Melissa is saying, thank you for this discussion. I really wish more medical doctors understood this. I struggled for so many years with strong histamine reaction related to my cycles. Yeah.
Yeah, I see that quite a lot. People have it anytime that the estrogen or the progesterone drops, then we can get these flare of symptoms.
Mac is saying, now that it's summertime and it's hot, when I go outside, I have mast cell lesions. What can I do about that?
So when reducing heat exposure in the meantime, and then work on what's going on underneath. Is there mold toxicity, chemical exposures? Fragrance is a big mast cell trigger, and there's fragrance in so many products today, and it's an immune disruptor, hormone disruptor. So coming back to that root piece.
Yeah, for sure. Okay. Hey, you guys. So there's so many questions that are coming in. Oh, it does a good one. Terry's asking, is there a relationship between MCAS, so mast cell activation, and dementia/brain cognition?
That's a great question as well. So there's a huge amount of mast cells in the brain. They're also in all of the different systems in the body, but many, many in the brain. And so if we have long-term mast cell activation and long-term inflammation, that does start to affect the neurons. And so what I'm seeing in the people that are really specializing in dementia, the functional practitioners who are specializing, a lot of their protocols are helping to calm mast cell activation.
Interesting. Right. And I remember, that was one of Yasmina's struggles. Like, she was going ballistic in her relationships with people. It was impacting her work situation. And she was diagnosed as being bipolar at one point too.
I actually was as well myself. I don't have those swings anymore, but I had received that diagnosis too. And there's something called mast cell rages. And if the brain mast cells are getting affected, it's like feeling like the Incredible Hulk, and you just can't calm it down. It's just this rage that overcomes you, and you just want to beat through the walls. Wow. It's very hard to manage until you can get those mast cells calmed down.
So, hey, you guys, so we're not ignoring your question. Beth is going to go over the weekend and take a look at them and answer or point you to some good resources. Beth, what I would love to do is point our listeners to a good resource. Let's just say, people who know they're suspecting they have that issue, or they know they have it because it's been confirmed. And but they are kind of clueless what to do next. Like, what would you suggest? What are the next steps? Where can they go? How they can get started to start feeling better, get on that journey?
So look at the free root causes report. Take a look and see which of those are affecting you, and start finding resources to address those. Really look at mold toxicity. And then I've got a great low histamine foods list on the website. And then start stepping through the blog. So we've got a ton of free resources on there, on the blog, all about these root causes, how to calm them down. And then I've got coming out, because we've got so many people who need this information, I'm going to start doing some free online, I'm doing free online Facebook Lives, and then I'm going to have some low-cost master classes that people can take in each of these different kinds of areas and start to step themselves through.
Okay. And in case we get questions, so you don't currently take on any private patients, right? Because your practice is full. But if people want to get on the wait list, or what do they do?
Yeah, so we're going to reopen towards the end of the year with new patient appointments. And people can just join the email list. If they get the free report, that'll put you on the email list, and you get the announcements about when we've got new spots open, when the new class is available. I've got a book that's going to come out hopefully the end of this year.
Yes,
and
that's
get
very
those
much needed.
resources.
That's so needed. So needed for sure. Hey, you guys, I'm gonna just also pop in the other URL that Beth was talking about, which is the syndromes checker, right? Syndrome symptom survey.
Right, exactly.
All right, let me pop that over here too. And so you can download that as well. Okay. All right. And hey, you guys, so many of you here live with us. So obviously a huge interest in this topic, which kind of is telling how much of an issue that is. Beth, just a question. What do you think is that? What would you suspect is the percentage of population that might be having histamine or mast cell activation problems?
You know, we don't have a clear study yet, but the best estimates really are between about 9 and 17%. So that's 1 in 10 people, or maybe even 1 in 9 or 1 in 8. It's quite a lot.
Yeah.
And then people, anybody that has chronic inflammation or a chronic condition, highly likely there's mast cell activation. So we're looking at about 50% of the chronically ill population or more. And there's huge amounts of research associating it with so many conditions: diabetes, cardiovascular issues, autoimmunity, any type of autoimmunity, even certain kinds of cancers.
Yeah, wow, that's incredible. Thank you so much for being here with us today on a Friday afternoon. And hey, you guys, so I hope this was helpful for you today to tune into this call, and maybe it has opened up your eyes to something that you haven't, you had a blind spot on before, you know, because we all have blind spots, me included. And yeah, I'm wishing you a wonderful weekend. All the resources for Beth are listed there. So, you know, if you want to reach out to her, just email her team, or just I'll get the report and start off from there with these resources. And hopefully that's going to be helpful for you. I know how transformative it is when you are dealing with years and years and years of mysterious conditions. You just don't know what the heck is going on. And you find this one thing that just start making sense. And you're like, oh my God, my 20 years, I'm kind of, you know, getting my life back now. So hopefully that's going to be for some of you here. Thanks so much, Beth, for being here. Wishing everybody a lovely weekend. Bye for now.
Thank you.